about, like, but to persuade my audience not drink and drive, remember that this would then be, there are 3 problems I will address. The first problem with drinking and driving, because we wouldn't be talking about the problems with not drinking and driving. That doesn't make sense. That's not our speech, right? So the first problems with drinking and driving. So after we've laid out the main point and we've laid out our subpoint, now we ask ourselves the question, does this subpoint warrant an explanation? So if I said the first problem with drinking and driving is that you could get in an accident. Does this sentence itself need an explanation based upon my audience and their knowledge of my topic? Good at shaking your heads, friends, so concretely, because that's true. You do not need to explain it, in my humble opinion. Your audience knows that there's problems already, like drinking and driving. They understand that these words, drinking and driving, a problem and an accident, and the word could get in an accident. You're not going to, right? But you could. Your audience knows this already. But in the future, or for other topics, or for topics that you may actually have, consider that your audience may not understand what things like, virtual contamination may mean. So this has led to the problem of virtual contamination. And then we're like, what the heck is that, right? In that case, you would want to write some kind of explanation of the subpoint itself. It is not mandatory, but it's, if your audience, you think it needs it or it's warranted, then go ahead and put it there. Once you've done that, we've made our claim, but now we need what? Yes. In unison. Because is this enough? No, my friends. Because we know that a proposition of policy, like I said before, when we were writing our thesis, we have to establish a need. It has to have a plan, and that plan has to be practical for this to work. Nobody's getting up off their tuchus, their butt, if we have not laid out a need. So how are we going to make sure that we lay out a need? That is typically done through some kind of evidence, showing that the problem we are saying is in fact a problem. Does that make sense? We want to then give evidence that the problem is a problem. First thing we talked about last time about making these problems, is this a problem that can come out of drinking and driving accidents? Is that true? That's a problem that can come out of drinking and driving? Yes, absolutely. Now, I need to tell you just how much of a problem this is. So, I am going to provide you with evidence. How much evidence you need is going to be really up to you and in consideration of who? The audience. What is it going to take to convince them that this, in fact, is a need? Often people will give one, maybe outside piece of evidence to say, hey, this happened and 53 people got in accidents over the past 20 years or 5 years, and that's why we need something. Although 20 people are very important, 20 people in the entire United States over the last 5 years, I don't know if that's a problem to be talking about. Is there enough evidence to show that this is what we call representative? of the problem. So what we asked is the first question. There was a fallacy that was disclosed in your Logos reading. And it talked about when we aren't giving enough evidence to support the claim that we're making. That we're suggesting that like, oh, well, here's a small piece of evidence. It can clearly be good for everything. Do you remember what the name of the fallacy is? It's okay, don't worry. We'll go over it together. It's called a hasty generalization. Oftentimes people will make these hasty generalizations and say, oh, well, there was this one case, and therefore we'll generalize it for everybody. And so we want to make sure that it's represented the problem, making sure that there is no generalizing and it's significant. I'm going to use the word enough. How will we know? Well, that's why we're going to also start to do these peer reviews. Is the statistic enough? Is it showing enough of the amount of people, right? Or is it showing that this is really happening in a lot of places? That would be a great way to show the representation of the problem, like showing some type of number. But if we think about our audience and we think about what moves them, go back to this idea of pathos. Are statistics enough? They may be, but they may not be for every what? Every claim, so every problem, for example, or every cause. It simply may not be enough to throw some statistics because not everybody's moved by numbers, right? So we have to remember that there are other ways that we can develop. As you go through your friends' outlines, ask, is this representative? Has this persuaded me? Is this piece of evidence the thing that's making me say, oh my gosh, I will never do that again? Or what else do you need beyond there? Like, the statistic is good, but I would really be convinced if there was a story from, or if there was a testimony here, if there was an example that maybe you could illustrate. Because that's going to show us what this audience may be more moved by. Facts or those statistics and numbers are always good, but oftentimes hearing the sentiment or hearing the emotional attachment or hearing somebody's experience is going to be good as well to back it up. So that can also be making sure that we have not only proved that it's a problem, but beyond that, is the evidence that we've provided enough in the minds of our audience? Does that make sense, y'all? Okay, cool. So keep that in mind as you go forward with the explanation of this, and then you're going to give evidence that the problem is in fact a problem. And then we need to make a claim here. If you open up your packet, if you have it, and you open it up to page 8, so we'll look at page 8 today, and then we'll look at also another page here somewhere. But we talked before about giving your claim with the reason, here's your becauses, and then here's your warrants. And your evidence. But now what we need to do is work on this idea of warrants. So we've made our claim and our reason, and we've provided us with some evidence to prove that these claims are true, but that means nothing without your warrant. It's really just an informative speech. Here's a problem and here's the evidence, here's some information about it. What we need to now do is use that evidence and that claim that you're making and say, so now let's take the next step and be persuasive with this. Let's show you how this problem is moving us towards taking action, that its existence is enough. But how is that done? Well, it's done by you explaining. I do not want to hear this statistic shows that a lot of people are doing it. Yes, that's what that statistic shows. Great. But I don't know what a lot of people doing it being a problem, all has to do with me going back to make a choice. It makes sense to you in your mind because you have an understanding of the entire topic. You understand what your solutions are and why this evidence is being used because of where you're eventually going to go. Your audience doesn't know that. And so your job is to walk them through the same steps or the same lines of reasoning that you too came up with. And that's what helped you to draw the conclusion. Seeing the numbers on their own may not make sense. Hearing that testimony may not make sense. So can you work to explain how that testimony or how those numbers, in fact, are showing this problem that's coming out of something? And in turn, that's why we need to do something. So let's look at what it says here in this warrant area. So the audience isn't in your head. Your job is to walk the audience through how you arrived at your claim or reason based upon the evidence provided. A warrant should not simply be one sentence. It can, that tells us what the data or evidence means. Although sometimes you may need to tell us that because we may not understand what those numbers are in general, but so we may need that. But instead, your warrants will show how the evidence supports your claim. So warrants serve as a bridge. That's really about it. That work to explicitly explain and connect the claim and the reason and the evidence all together. We want to explicitly say it because oftentimes our arguments implicitly are clear in our head. And if you remember from your Logos reading in regards to deductive reasoning, did you read about the syllogism? Or did you hear that word? An enthymeme? Did you hear that word? Did you? You wrote it?
Read the word?
You read the word, the enthymeme. Our friend Aristotle back in the day, he was all hip on this concept of the enthymeme, meaning that we allow the audience to arrive at their own conclusion, that we give them all the information, we allow them to arrive at their own conclusion. It works in as much as the same thing like a good rhetorical question to start your speech. If I've done a good rhetorical question to start my speech, great. But if I ask a rhetorical question that none of you can identify with or understand, or a hypothetical situation, we talked about that before too, using these hypothetical situations, then it's not going to work as well because then our argument won't come to the end. For example, I had a student one time in this rhetorical theory class that I used to teach, and in the rhetorical theory class, the student finally raises his hand after we're talking about logic for the 8th day, and he's like, I thought communication studies was supposed to be easy. That's why football players major in it. What's the unstated premise? Do you get this? Have you heard this before? Replace communication with sociology? I don't know. I've heard this statement before a million times. What's your easy class on campus? Do you have one? Everyone's like, oh yeah, take a class. When I make this statement, oh God, I thought communication studies was supposed to be easy. That's why football players major in it. What's the unstated? That we know as a collective group because it's a common assumption, a stereotype, but I don't need to say it out loud. Thank you, Kevin.
Football players are stupid.
Have we ever heard that claim before in your life? Did anybody else have that unstated premise, but just didn't want to say it out loud? Football players aren't stupid. Not all football players are dumb and unintelligent and not, this isn't it. But we make these claims like, okay, that they are. So it's like, oh, yeah, they do the easy major so that they don't have to do anything, right? This idea. So in this case, I thought this we're saying like, oh, communication studies is supposed to be easy. That's why football players major in it. The unstated premise is football players are dumb or not as smart as everybody else, right? So they'll take this like easy major. The unstated premise works only in as much as your audience gets it. Most bumper stickers are like this. It's a social and a cultural thing that we're almost oftentimes in on, where we don't have to make the end statement, if you will, or one of the premises can be missing because it exists within the mind of the audience. But as we had only Gavin raise his hand, we now know that that's why you have to walk people through. Because this individual drew to a conclusion. Communication is supposed to be easy. What's my evidence? Football players are majoring in it. But what's the unstated claim that made that link in his own logical mind that he did not express to maybe us? Is that football players are not smart and they're looking for an easy way out. And that's why they are constantly majoring in things that maybe aren't as difficult. So does this make sense? So it's walking you through that statement. What is it about that evidence that maybe your audience didn't see? Or what is it about the conclusion that that evidence now has so much to provide for? So questions that can help you, the speaker, to start making the connection and start to work on that writing or that warrant or that bridge, as it says here at the bottom of page 8. You can simply start asking the questions like, how does this evidence support the claim being made in the topic sentence? What does the evidence support? Why does the evidence support the claim being made in the topic sentence? Think, so what? Why should I care about this? Literally, after you put the evidence, go, so what? Why? Why does this matter? Why does it matter? Why does it count? How does it work? Why is that supporting material so important for my claim to be true? So that may be one question that you can ask. Like, why is this important? Like, if this is true, then this must be true as well. You can start making those connections. Or what makes this evidence so convincing? What is making it so compelling? My favorite way of doing it, my favorite way of doing it is saying that this evidence proves or supports my claim because, but I would never write those words out in real life. I could write it, but then what I do is I eliminate that italicized part, like I said here down at the bottom of the page. After I have written it, like just take out that part, and I'll usually have a good warrant as to what it is after, if that makes sense at all. Does that make sense? Or a little bit of help? So let us then, I wanted to, okay. Evidence that proves it's a problem, and then some kind of warrant statement. Now, a great way to reason with this is also to potentially incorporate a solution here. And we're going to talk about that as soon as we finish up with some of our evaluations. What I want you to do is look to why don't we go ahead, how many of you, where's my work?